to this month's Advocacy Institute. This, of course, being ALS Awareness Month. We're very pleased to be able to present you all with an update on the implementation of the Act for ALS, which I know many of you are familiar with given our work on the Act for ALS last year in having it pass Congress and then signed by President Biden, and now this year implementing the legislation. So why don't we move to the next slide? I'll let you know what we're talking about and also just do a few items of housekeeping. So again, we're going to start, well, actually, let me just introduce myself first. I think that probably would be wise. I'm Paul Mellmeyer. I lead the MDA Public Policy and Advocacy team. And we at MDA, of course, if you don't know us in the Policy and Advocacy team, we focus on increasing access to care, accelerating therapeutic developments, and knocking down both economic and societal barriers for those with neuromuscular disabilities. So consequently, Act for ALS, of course, in its attempt to both accelerate treatment development for those with ALS and those with rare neurodegenerative diseases, as well as increasing access to investigational therapies for those with ALS. Certainly legislation that we know will be quite impactful for our community. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be refreshing you all on just what the Act for ALS is. This might be a new law for some of you. Perhaps you haven't actually heard of the law before, or you're coming to join us tonight to learn about it. So we're going to do a quick refresher, and then I'm going to turn it over to two of the foremost experts in the implementation of the law, Dr. Christine Torberg, as well as Dr. Caparello at the National Institutes for Neurological Disorders and Stroke. And they'll be talking about the implementation of especially the ALS Expanded Access Program that NIH has very recently announced new details on. So very excited to hear more from both of them. Just to go back to the agenda, they're not gonna just talk about the Act for ALS and implementation of the ALS Expanded Access Program. Also be touching on updates on the ALS Strategic Plan, as well as a few updates on the ongoing work to implement the public-private partnership that was also commissioned by the Act for ALS. From there, we're going to take your questions, and just to let you know where and how to ask us questions. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you see the Q&A box there. That's how you can send in questions to us. You can send a question to me. You can send a question to Dr. Torberg and Dr. Caparello, and we'll take questions on the NIH portion of Act for ALS, as well as the other things that our guests will be speaking about following their presentation. So please, again, the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box is where to submit your question. From there, we're gonna just touch a little bit on the portions of the legislation that have to do, or that is being implemented by the FDA, including the Action Plan for Regulatory Innovation, as well as the Research Grants Program. And then we're gonna look ahead on what comes next for Act for ALS, not just in its implementation, but also in its funding. And then we'll close with any additional questions that you might have at the end of the call. Just a few items of housekeeping. Again, this is being recorded, so if there's anything you missed during our session today, we're going to post this up on our advocacy websites in hopefully just a few days. You can find us there at www.mda.org/advocacy. And heck, while you're there, if you're not already part of our advocacy network, you can also join us as an advocate. You can also text MDA USA to 50457, and there'll be lots of opportunities to support the work that we're doing in service of the neuromuscular disease community there. We have the link also in the chat box there if you want to just click on the hyperlink there. Okay, I think we are ready to get moving with our agenda. First, let me just tell you a little bit more about the guests that we have joining us. I'm really excited to have both Dr. Torberg and Dr. Caparello here. So I'll start with Dr. Christine Torberg. Dr. Torberg is a senior policy analyst in the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, Office of Science, Policy, and Planning. Dr. Torberg covers legislative and congressional issues and coordinates strategic planning, evaluation, and reporting activities, and conducts policy and program analyses. Dr. Torberg has been helping to coordinate implementation of Act for ALS and is organizing the NIH strategic planning effort at ALS, for ALS at NIH. So really, again, one of the foremost experts at NIH, at NINDS on ALS. So really thrilled to have Dr. Torberg with us here. Also, we have Dr. Emily Caparello, who's the director of the Small Business Program in the Division of Translational Research at NINDS. And Dr. Caparello has worked at NINDS now for several years, leveraging her extensive experience in translational neuroscience program management as a scientific project manager within the NINDS Small Business Program. So we're thrilled to have both Dr. Torberg and Dr. Caparello here. And as I mentioned at the outset, not only can they answer questions that you can pose live to us through the Q&A box, and we'll answer those questions that are, of course, germane and relevant to our topic today, which is Act for ALS and NIH's work within ALS. We'll also be answering the questions that you submitted to us already. As you registered, you might have seen there's the opportunity to submit questions ahead of time. Those questions have been with Dr. Torberg and Dr. Caparello, and they are worked into their presentation. So their presentation will be asking those questions that you had submitted ahead of time as well. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide, in which I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the Act for ALS, because again, this might be actually a new topic for some folks who are joining us for the first time on just what the Act for ALS is. So this is a law that was signed into law by President Biden on December 23rd of last year. And actually that was only about 6 months after it was introduced. It was actually on this very Advocacy Institute last May, where we had Representative Quigley, we had Representative Fortenberry joining us, and on our Advocacy Institute, they announced that they would be introducing the Act for ALS. So it's almost, I don't know the exact anniversary of the introduction date, but I think we're about there, of 1 year anniversary since the bill was introduced in the first place, which is remarkable to consider that it only took about 5 months to then pass, 6 months to then pass. That's a lot quicker than most bills. And also within that passage, there was an authorization of $100 million per year for 5 years to do these 4 main things that you see in front of you. So the first main thing, and again, what we're going to really be focusing on today, is the ALS Expanded Access Program. And this is an NIH funded program for expanded access to investigational ALS therapies outside of phase 3 clinical trials. And I'm just going to stop there because, again, Dr. Torberg is going to go in much greater detail on that and how it's being implemented here in a few moments. A second provision of Act for ALS is an HHS public-private partnership. And this PPP is between the NIH, the FDA, and other stakeholders to increase disease understanding and to foster therapeutic developments in the rare neurodegenerative disease space. Now, please note, for those of you who are tuning in who might perhaps not be either living with ALS or have a loved one with ALS or are just part of the ALS community, perhaps you're part of the broader neuromuscular disease community and you're hearing me say a lot about ALS already. Well, actually, Act for ALS does a lot that is not just specific to ALS. The Expanded Access Program is, but the 3 additional provisions here you see on your screen are actually for all rare neurodegenerative diseases. And of course, that's many neuromuscular diseases. In many ways, all of this will help all neuromuscular diseases as well. And so the public-private partnership will be working on rare neurodegenerative diseases more broadly, on how to collaborate, on how to break down barriers that are still in front of therapeutic development within the rare neurodegenerative disease space. Also, this law commissioned an FDA action plan. And this action plan, in this action plan, FDA will detail actions and initiatives to accelerate drug development in rare neurodegenerative diseases over the next 5 years. Basically, this is FDA saying, over the next 5 years, here's what we're going to do to try to get more treatments and better treatments to not just the ALS community, but also the rare neurodegenerative disease community more broadly. And then finally, a provision on a research grants program in which FDA will actually be able to infuse funding into promising efforts to actually develop new treatments. They can actually invest in clinical trials in that way, as well as invest in new tools to test treatments, new diagnostics, natural history studies. I'll go into those specifics at the end of our hour here today. But as you can see, it's a broad array of things these 4 main provisions do within the Act for ALS. And this is law. This was passed and signed by President Biden on December 23rd of last year. So of course, ever since then, we've been focusing on two things. We've been focusing on funding the legislation, because it's one thing for Congress to authorize the legislation. They then need to actually appropriate the funds to actually pay for it. So that's one thing we've been focusing on. And then the second, of course, is on implementation, which is our focus today. But before we get there, just to note the funding that actually has been passed by Congress as part of the early March omnibus appropriations legislation that Congress passed. They appropriated $25 million for this fiscal year. So that would be that March day, I think it was March 11th, perhaps, up until September 30th of this year, $25 million to go to the NIH Expanded Access Grants Program, and also $5 million to go to the FDA Research Grants Program. And then additional funding that's not necessarily directed towards specifically Act for ALS, but directed towards NIH and FDA to help implement the action plan and to help implement the public-private partnership. Now, I'll get back to these numbers and why you see 25 and 5, that's 30 million. That's not 100 million that was authorized. We'll get back to that a little bit later and our update on where Congress stands in appropriations for fiscal year 23, which starts in October. But before we do that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Christine Torberg, who is going to be giving us an overview of where NIH is right now with the implementation of the Expanded Access Grants Program, as well as an update on the effort on the ALS strategic plan, and anything else Dr. Torberg wants to tell us about. So Dr. Torberg, over to you.
Thank you. As you know, I'm Christine Torberg. I work in the NINDS Office of Science Policy and Planning. I'm here with my colleague, Emily Caparello, who is a program director leading our small business programs and is very engaged in translational research for ALS right now. The strategic planning session on translational research she is helping to lead. We are actually here in the place of our colleague, Dr. Amelie Gubitz, who is amazing, and she knows everything ALS. She knows everything way more than Emily and I do. So if you have questions we can't answer, we may have to go to Amelie to ask them. Unfortunately, she just was unable to be here tonight. So we're trying to step into some big shoes here. So if you go to the next slide. So as Paul mentioned, Act for ALS was passed into law on December 23rd, 2021, and it has two provisions that largely affect NIH. So one is the Expanded Access Grants Program. It is for research utilizing data from expanded access to investigational therapies for individuals who are not otherwise eligible for clinical trials. And it's really limited to phase 3 clinical trial sites that are sponsored by a small business concern. So this was the idea that that the government wouldn't be paying for drugs, expanded access to drugs that are sponsored by large companies who have deep pockets themselves. So this is for small businesses who wouldn't be able to provide expanded access or research utilizing from expanded access outside of a program like this. The other main provision that affects NIH is the public-private partnership, which includes both NIH and FDA. And this is both focused on advancing regulatory science and accelerating scientific research for ALS. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the Expanded Access Program at NIH. So NIH just released a request for applications for the Expanded Access Grant Program. These applications are due in June so that we can get through the NIH review process in time to award the grants by mid-September so that we can use the FY22 funds that we have received. In the request for applications, it says that NINDS intends to commit $16.5 million in direct costs in FY22 to fund 2 to 3 awards. So as you notice, that's not $25 million, but the issue here is direct versus indirect costs. So there's the direct costs for doing the research, and then there's sort of overhead costs that go with that. And those are calculated by a formula that we can't predict in advance. So we're saying It's about 16.5 million direct costs total. And then there will be additional funds spent on it for those indirect costs. But this is all approximates that we're putting out right now. We expect to fund 2 to 3 awards. I know there had been a question about how many slots will that be for individuals participating in who want to participate in these studies. We don't know. So that will really be determined by the grantee, the grant applicants, and they will say, you know, how many slots they could possibly support, how much it costs for each of those slots, and overall how much. It's limited by the number of dollars we have, but also by how expensive are the treatments and the research that they plan to conduct. So we can't predict that at this point. When people submit, when organizations submit their grant application to NIH, they have to have first submitted an application to the FDA for authorization for that expanded access. And the FDA has 30 days to approve or disapprove of that expanded access application. And so that the FDA will have already said yes or no by the time we review the grants at NIH. And so, and at that point, the FDA isn't really going to be involved in the review process for the grants. That's going to be largely governed by the NIH review process. We will be reviewed in the NIH study sections, and this will have ALS experts as well as general clinical trials experts, but we also plan to include persons living with ALS on these study sections to weigh in on whether or not the research questions that they're planning to ask are important, or all other aspects of the grant application. The applications will then go to our NINDS Advisory Council, which meets in September. I think there's a few things that are important to note about what has to be in the application. So all of the applications really have to be focused on an important scientific research objective. So NIH is a research institute. We're not a clinical care institute. And so while one of the goals is to provide access to investigational therapies for people who otherwise wouldn't have access to those therapies, it's really in the context of what are we learning in that process? What kinds of data would we collect, information would we collect? So what the questions are, the research questions are, will really be up to the grant applicants to decide. And those could be questions surrounding biomarkers, identifying new biomarkers, or safety or outcomes information, or could be other patient experience data that is not specifically tied to assessing the efficacy of the drug. So there's a lot of research questions that could be asked. It's up to the grant applicant to say what would be an important research question that they're planning to ask, and how are they going to ask that. And that will be part of the NIH review process to look at those questions. And it's important to note, expanded access participants must not be eligible for other ALS clinical trials. This is actually in the law. So most of the things in the RFA, and the things that I'm pointing out to you here, are all things that were actually specifically enumerated in the legislation. And we have stuck very close to the legislation when writing the RFA. It's important to do that, otherwise we might not be able to have this program that the legislation authorized us to do this program. We have also another important point that was in the legislation is that it's limited to phase 3 clinical trial sites sponsored by a small business concern. And it actually, in the legislation, explicitly refers to another piece of legislation that defines small business concern. And there's, and my colleague Emily here actually leads our small business program. And so she's very familiar with what is needed to be eligible for that program or not. So certainly if there are businesses out there that are wondering would they be eligible or not, they can contact Emily and she can help guide them through that process of ensuring that they're eligible. The other parts I think that people are interested in is that this is an intermediate patient population. Expanded access is what we're talking about. What does that mean in terms of size? So this is how the FDA defines the different categories of expanded access authorizations that they have. And an intermediate patient population can actually be very large. It can actually be approval for or authorization for involving hundreds or even thousands of people if it's appropriate. It's really about some of it. I don't understand all of it. We had many meetings with the FDA and they said this is the appropriate approval process to use. But it's part of it is about where they are within the drug development process and are they near marketing or are they still in the phase 3 clinical trials portion? And so this was the most appropriate based on that. The other thing that we put in the FOA or in the RFA, the request for applications announcement, that I don't think we can enforce, but we really are strongly encouraging anyone who contacts us saying they're interested in the program as well, is to establish relationships with patient groups or solicit input from patients or patient advisory boards up front in the application process, because really the most important relationship there is with the actual people who will be doing the research and who will be funding or the sites that will be organizing their expanded access programs. So I think that's most of what I wanted to say about this slide. So if we move on to the next slide, just to give you a sense of the timeline of all of this, we put down. So in March, we had a listening session with the FDA and NIH and advocates, and I know the Muscular Dystrophy Association was there when we first started talking about this. It was also in March that the appropriations bill came out, so we knew we had money to do this program. So we could start putting out information about what this program might look like and start the process of soliciting applications. So then we, in April, put out a notice of intent to publish, and this was just saying to the community something's coming. Here's a little bit, just a high-level overview of what that will be, so they could start thinking about it and being aware of the program. May 12th, we released the request for applications. It was published. Applications will be due June 17th. In late July or early August will be the study section reviews. So the NIH review, first level review of applications. Then those will go to our advisory council on September 7th and 8th. And then by mid-September, applicants should receive, applicants who have been recommended for funding should receive their notice of award so that we can get the money out the door before October 1st, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year. So it's I will say this is a very tight timeline for NIH. We've had a lot of people working very hard to make these deadlines. So we're excited about this program, and hopefully we can learn some good information from these grants. So I don't know if it's best, if are there questions in the chat that we should answer about this program, and should we just do this part now if there are any questions?
I'll tell you what, why don't we stop for a few questions we have right now, and then you can continue along with the additional parts, and if additional questions come in, that's fine. Dr. Caparello, I did see though that you unmuted. Did you want to add anything first to Dr. Torberg's presentation?
That was so well described, Christine. Thank you. I just wanted to emphasize that a lot of the restrictions, so we've heard from potential applicants of the community, why is it set up the way it is? Why are the, applicants restricted to such and such, or why is the budget restricted? And I just wanted to emphasize Christine's point that it is derived directly from the bill language, because the authorization to spend this money is under the Act for ALS language. It's really important that we structure the funding opportunity to sort of match the directive of the law. So that's the rationale for a lot of the things you'll see there. So for instance, I think this touches on one of the questions that came in. The bill language requires that it is the participating clinical site that is the recipient of the fund. So the RFA specifies that the clinical site needs to be the applicant. It could also be a group of clinical sites, but one or more clinical sites is the applicant, and the small business, the sponsor of the drug, they should be the sponsor on the IND, but they themselves are not the applicant. So there are some very specific things like that in there that are derived from the law, and I just also add myself, Dr. Amelie Gubitz, who is from the Division of Neuroscience, and Dr. Robin Conway, who's from the Division of Clinical Research, and myself, we're the 3 program contacts for the RFA, and we are very, very happy to speak to applicants about any questions that they might have. So I really want to emphasize, we recognize that this timeline is tight. It's tight because we want to get these funds out. We want to get the expanded access drugs to patients and have that happen quickly as the bill intended. But we recognize it's fast, and we really are there to walk people through any questions they have. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to us so we can help your application.
Thanks so much, Dr. Caparello, and thank you, Dr. Torberg, as well. You did already answer 2 of the questions that came in. Both of them were asking about who is actually the participating entity, who is the applicant. Is it the site? Is it the site or sites, plural, or is it the biotech that is technically the applicant or technically the participating entity? I think there was some confusion, so I'm glad that you already got that one out of the way. Thank you. There's a somewhat similar question from Karen, and I know Karen, she says she represents a small business concern, and they actually already have an ongoing expanded access program within ALS. And she's wondering, do they need to propose a brand new EAP at new sites, or can the same investigational drug, the same expanded access program ongoing right now for that matter, be considered for funding through this RFA?
So as long as the approved expanded access protocol meets the criteria in that it's, it's for ALS, it's, a small business concern, which is already addressed here, and it's off of a phase 3 or efficacy study for ALS. As long as all that's fulfilled, if you already have your approval for that EAP, that is great, that is fine. It's really just, we have to have that approval in place prior to review. So the application, for those who have not yet gotten that approval, that application needs to go in by June 17th, which is the application date for the RFA.
Great, thank you. And
and I would, sorry, I'm so sorry, Paul, but I would emphasize, definitely, Karen, again, if you're thinking of applying, please reach out and I'd be happy to talk to you in depth about this particular scenario and go through any questions.
And actually, can I ask, where can we find you? Is it on the RFA? Like where
oh yeah, so we're listed on, so myself and my colleagues, Dr. Conway and Dr. Gubitz, are all listed on the RFA. That's probably the easiest way to find it. I can also put my email in the chat. Happy to do that. But yeah, we're listed on the RFA, and that should probably be the easiest way.
So that's how folks can find you. That's really great. Thank you for that. And I did want to mention just a couple just quick responses to the, is the applicant the trial site or is it the biotech? Because as Daniel wrote back there's some concern about the way that this is structured because sites might not be well resourced enough or properly informed to kind of go through this process. And so I think there are some concerned about the setup of this, but I think, as you well said, Dr. Caparello, this is straight from the statute. This is straight from the implementing language that you all have to then implement, or the language you have to implement. So perhaps flexibility isn't there for you to do anything differently.
Unfortunately not. And we really, I mean, we've tried to see where we can provide additional flexibility, but there are some things that are very clearly written in the law, in the language, where we are kind of, we have what we have in that law, and we have to structure the funding opportunity to match it. And that was one thing that's quite specifically laid out there, as are the use of funds. The use of funds under the bill are very clearly spelled out in the law as well.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions before I turn it back to Dr. Torberg to talk about the public-private partnership, but a couple others that are directly relevant to this. Michelle writes in, and Michelle, of course, is one of the main leading advocates behind this whole effort. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us this evening. She's asking about if the expanded access programs that are eligible for the grants, if it's only intermediate expanded access programs, or could large group expanded access programs also potentially qualify under the RFA?
So I believe it's intermediate, but in our discussion with the FDA, again, I'm not the FDA, so I can't say for sure, but my understanding is that that intermediate size can actually be quite large. So we brought up the concern of, is it going to be limiting if it's an intermediate sized EAP? And their answer really was a clear no. No, it's not going to be restricting. Intermediate size can cover a very broad range. So again, we're this sort of the language we have. If there's a concern about this, so if someone has an intermediate size and they're worried this isn't going to be big enough, again, please come talk to us specifically about that. But my understanding and our understanding with the FDA is that intermediate size can actually be quite large, and that's why they felt that that language was appropriate. I don't know, Christine, if there's anything you would add to that.
I mean, I would add to that. They give us examples of tens of thousands of people who were in programs for intermediate sized expanded access, and that the real issue is there's the individual, like one person, who has a rare disease getting a drug kind of thing, and then there's the intermediate size, which in some ways is more about timing. And then I can't remember what the largest one, the final one is called. I think it's global or something. But that's really like after it's sort of like the just before marketing. It's where the phase 3 clinical trials are done and they're like not ready to have the drug be fully marketed yet, but it's really close to being marketed. And the drugs that we're looking at through this expanded access program are just earlier in development, early in the stage of development. So they're still in phase 3 clinical trials or just after the phase 3 clinical trials and not at that fully marketed stage. And I think that it can go up to that for intermediate. That would be clarification from the FDA, but there's nothing out there right now that's at that just before marketing stage.
For more than, these very, very like 10,000 people.
Right.
So that's our understanding from, sort of discussing with the FDA as to why they felt very strongly the intermediate size expanded access was appropriate and not restricting.
Yeah, I think that's all well said. From our understanding, intermediate size is also kind of gives the greatest flexibility in that it can be both during the phase 3, it can be actually earlier than phase 3 under other circumstances, not under this, of course, due to the statute, but really any expanded access program that we could expect that we would potentially want to participate in this could qualify as an intermediate, whereas a widespread or a global or a large group is actually a little bit more limiting and kind of it's at the very end stage after the NDA and BLA is already submitted. And we know there's a lot of programs, obviously, that aren't at that stage who we hope can participate within this. So I think that flexibility is afforded by it being the intermediate group that qualifies. Okay, I'm gonna just ask one more question of you and then I promise Dr. Torberg will turn back to you. And this comes from Stephen, who asks, within the RFA or really anywhere else, is the NIH giving any advice or giving any guidance on how companies should be interacting with patients? His specific question is, how do people with ALS apply to be a part of an advisory board for the Expanded Access Grant Program? Is that anything that you all are putting out there, or are you leaving that to the companies to figure out?
So it is up to the applicants. So it is intended that the applicants, the companies and clinical sites are closely working with patients, both in developing the research strategy and research questions that they're asking, as well as the execution of the project. So it is not the design that NIH would be putting together a board that would, then be implemented in all these sites. We want that to be a cohesive group from the beginning, including all of the, hopefully a representative group of PALs, CALs, and other people from the ALS community. So that is the intention. I would say, I think the ALS community is aware of a lot of the potential drugs that could be relevant for this funding opportunity. I certainly would encourage reaching out. Same with clinical sites that are involved in phase 3s. We hope that it will be a part of applications coming in, that we will see clear representation from the community in those projects.
Splendid, thank you. There are a couple more questions coming in, but I want to be sure we're able to get through the presentation. So we'll get to additional questions at the end of Dr. Torberg's presentation here in just a bit. But for now, Dr. Torberg, I'd like to turn it back to you to give us an update, I believe, on the public-private partnership.
So next slide. I will say I don't have much to update you on, except to say that we're really working on it. So what it is that the NIH and FDA are authorized to use contracts or cooperative agreements to establish public-private partnership for neurodegenerative diseases. We would establish it with other public or private entities. This could be in nonprofits or university organizations. It would focus on advancing regulatory science and scientific research and foster the development of effective drugs. We have been very focused on getting the RFA out for the Expanded Access Program, and most of our discussions with the FDA have been around that. We are right now actually turning to focus heavily on what this public-private partnership will be. We have a meeting next week with the FDA to discuss it, in fact. So I don't have much more to tell you about than that. Then we are actively engaged in figuring it out, and that there will be more publicly about it this calendar year. According to in the legislation, we had a year to establish the public-private partnership. So, and we can't really say anything publicly yet because we're still in the process of figuring out what it will all look like and talking to the FDA about that. But we do meet regularly with the FDA, as you know, for this Expanded Access Grants Program, for the public-private partnership, and also actually for some of, I think, one of the programs that you are going to be talking about a little later with the FDA. They reach out to us to say, what are you doing in this space, and sort of making sure we don't have overlapping programs. So if we move on to the next slide, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about that the Act for ALS is not all of our funding for ALS research, and the program's an Act for ALS. So ALS funding, fortunately, has increased quite a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. In 2015, 2016, it was about 50 million, and we've more than doubled since then. By last year, we spent 120 million on funding for ALS. And this means we really have to think more closely about how we're spending the money. And I mean, we're spending money on good research, but just making sure that we've covered the full landscape and aren't missing any sort of important research questions, that we understand what the highest priority research areas are. And so we have started a strategic planning effort this year that will be going on. If we go to the next slide. The NIH ALS strategic planning effort is ongoing right now. The goal is to identify the highest priorities for research that will lead to the discovery of effective interventions for the diagnosis, treatment, management, prevention, or cure of ALS. And so as part of this, we have established a large strategic planning effort that includes a steering committee that has scientists who are at the forefront. So we have Dr. Bob Brown and Dr. Rita Sattler and Dr. Aaron Gittler, who are on the steering committee. But we also have a person living with ALS, Wayne Olaf, who I know is very involved in the ALS community, and a person who is formerly a caregiver of somebody of her husband who had died from ALS, so Ellen Phillips, are on our steering committee, and they're helping to organize the overall effort and are actively participating in many of our working groups. And we also have 5 working groups working on the strategic plan, one on basic science. So this is understanding the disease mechanisms. This is sort of what you think of more as laboratory research. There's the translational working group, and that actually Emily is leading that group for translating those basic science discoveries into therapies. There's a clinical research working group to help identify the priorities for improving clinical research in ALS. A quality of life working group, looking at the first 3 working groups are really focused on identifying prevention strategies and cures, but for people who are already living with ALS, how can we improve their quality of life? And then there's a 5th working group on partnerships and collaboration. How can we partner with nonprofits and industry organizations and partner across academic research organizations as well. Each of these working groups has scientists and clinicians, and also people living with ALS, caregivers, or people who are at risk of developing ALS. People who have family histories of ALS who are on these working groups. They are currently meeting, just right now, starting to have their initial meetings of those working groups. But before we established the working groups, we actually started with a public request for information. So this public request for information, I know the MDA Association, or MDA has responded to this request for information, was basically asking the entire community, what is the most important research we should be doing for ALS? We received over 300 responses. These are from people with living with ALS, various advocates, caregivers, people at risk of developing ALS, and the researchers, research organizations, and also advocacy organizations all responded to this public request for information. We've summarized the responses and given them to the working groups. We've given the full responses and the summaries to the working groups. We will be posting a summary of the responses very soon. I was just working on it this morning to try to get it finalized on our strategic planning website. And these responses are really forming, we did this first because we wanted the working groups to be starting with these responses to help guide their conversations. They will be developing draft priorities over the next few months, which we will post online in October before our public meeting. We will have a public meeting on October 26th and 27th. It will be virtual, which I know is always difficult, but it also, in the era of COVID, we were unable to plan efficiently for whether or not we would be able to have an in-person meeting or not. So we thought a virtual workshop would allow the greatest amount of participation and from people who wouldn't otherwise be able to travel. So we'll post the priorities online before the meeting. At the meeting, there will be a lot of opportunities for discussion and public comment. After the meeting, the working groups will be asked to revise the priorities based on the discussion of the public meeting. And then we'll post them again for public comment, formal public comment, before they're sort of go through the official processes that need to happen through our advisory committee. We have to get all the advice we get has to go through our advisory committee. And so that will happen in February. Early February is when that committee meets. I will say that even before then, even now as the discussions are happening, NINDS is definitely listening to what people are saying, and it's influencing, starting to think about what we can do to advance these priorities that are being discussed and to learn more about them. I also want to point out that NINDS is leading this effort, but it isn't just NINDS that's involved. So we are engaging a number of other NIH institutes, and they're ex officio members. They're mostly just listening in and saying, to hear discussions, to know what's going on, to see how these priorities are developed, and to know what's happening. We've also are engaging other federal agencies. So the Veterans Administration, the VA, the CDC National ALS Registry is a part of this process. The did I say the FDA already? The FDA is already is sending people, and the Department of Defense, which also has a research program for ALS, are all being engaged, again, in that sort of ex officio manner. They're there to answer questions and hear the discussion, but not necessarily to drive the priorities going forward. That's really about the working groups, which are the research and advocacy communities are on those working groups. So I think those are the main things to say. I think the question that always comes up is what's going to be done to implement these priorities. And that is always a challenging question because we don't know what they will be. So, we don't know what they will be, and we don't know what resources we will have. I will say that they will certainly help influence decision-making. Some of the things we can do or we have high program priority grant processes that we can then use this process to identify grants that would be considered high program priority. There are other potential opportunities for influencing things like even whether if there is funding for funding opportunity announcements, it could influence that. There are other ways of changing programs that we currently have to be better aligned with what the priorities are for ALS. So there are just a broader array of things we could do to implement the strategic planning processes to identify the priorities, and then we'll figure out what are the best ways NIH can address those priorities, or how can we partner with other parts of the research community, other agencies like the Department of Defense or the CDC to implement these priorities going forward. But these kinds of discussions are sort of to get the community all on the same page about what's most important. And I think that's all I have to say about this. I do want to say for all of this, this is a whole team of people. It's not just me and Emily, or even also Amelie, whom we mentioned earlier. So Dr. Robin Conwit has been a very important part of our ALS strategic planning team and our ALS team. She handles, she's in the Division of Clinical Research. Got Dr. Jane Hettinger, Dr. Sam White, and Carla Quintanilla, and Dr. Shanta Rajaram. There's a huge team of people at NINDS who are working on both the strategic plan, but all of the other grants programs we have. And I wanted to make sure to mention all of them. So if there are questions, or if there's something I forgot to say, Emily, if you would like to chime in.
No, nothing you forgot to say, Christine. I will say, Paul, I saw one of the questions was about the cost of manufacturing of the drug and whether that was covered in the RFA, and that is. So that is one of the clear guidance in the law, is that manufacturing of the drug is an allowable cost for this funding. And I think the question may have referred to whether, like, how much of the budget can be used for that. There is no explicit restriction on that. So, you know, it should be appropriate funding for both the manufacturing and the conducting of the study.
Yeah, thank you both, and Dr. Torberg, thank you so much for that fantastic overview, and Dr. Caparello, thanks for jumping in with that question. Yeah, the question asked about the 8.5 million that isn't going to the 16.5 million on direct costs, but the 8.5 that you put together for 25. If that would be covering the manufacturing, it sounds as if manufacturing actually goes into the direct cost.
That's right. That's right. So yes, so thanks for that clarification. Yeah, manufacturing of the drug can be under the direct cost of the grant. It's 16.5, not not fully 25 because one, as Christine mentioned, these are direct costs and institutions will have an overhead rate that will be applied on top of that. So there's indirect costs. In addition, I think something to make sure we're clear about is that the allocated funds of 25 million for this act are for all the activities under the act, not just this RFA. And so it's something to keep in mind that 25 million will go to fund all the activities under the full Act for ALS bill.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, Dr. Torberg, did you want to add something?
Oh, I was just going to add, we do anticipate that, as much as 80 to 90% of those funds would be the expanded access program, that they will be the bulk of the program. But for example, the public-private partnership will cost money. And so that will be part of this.
Sure. Okay. We have just a few more slides. I know we have 2 more questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to get those at the very end, but I want to be sure that we actually get through the presentation just so we cover everything that we have to cover with an Act for ALS and where we go from here. So we've been spending a lot of time on, of course, the parts that are directly implicating NIH, those being the Expanded Access Grants Program, as well as the public-private partnership. But I wanted to say just a few words on the additional 2 provisions within Act for ALS. The first being the ALS and other rare neurodegenerative disease action plan. And actually, this is something that we might be able to expect quite shortly, because under the statutes, the FDA has 6 months to publish this action plan on their webpage. And what this action plan does is that it would cover program enhancements, policy developments, regulatory science initiatives, and other appropriate initiatives to foster development of treatments for rare neurodegenerative diseases, as well as to increase access to investigational drugs. So this is, again, as I said at the outset, essentially FDA publishing in the next 5 years how they're anticipating through their own mechanisms, through their own initiatives, through their own jurisdiction to accelerate the development of new treatments for ALS and other rare neurodegenerative diseases, as well as access to investigational treatments in this area. So I think we're all very much looking forward to FDA's publishing of this. We know they have a cross-center team working on this. We have talked to that team. It's actually a call that we were on with Dr. Torberg and perhaps Dr. Caparillo as well in March, in which we were able to, MDA was actually able to put forward what we're hoping will be covered within that action plan, what we're hoping FDA will be publishing about, what FDA will be doing over the next 5 years in this. But similar to everything else that isn't yet public, that isn't quite fully baked or implemented yet, we have to wait until it actually is fully baked to see what FDA will be coming forward with on this action plan. So hopefully, fingers crossed, within the next month, actually almost exactly a month, June 23rd being the congressionally set deadline on that, we will have that document in our hands for all of us to digest. The fourth and final area of the Act for ALS I wanted to mention is on the Rare Neurodegenerative Disease Grants Program. And this is a program that will be housed, likely housed, we don't know for 100% sure, but likely housed within FDA's Office of Orphan Product Development. And this is a grants program that can actually allow FDA to infuse dollars into efforts that are developing new treatments, that are developing new tools, methods, and approaches within the context of developing new treatments for ALS and other rare neurodegenerative diseases. Natural history studies qualify for funding under this grants program, as well as other kind of the development of new trial mechanisms and methods for that matter, all again with the aim of trying to get more and better treatments to the ALS and rare neurodegenerative disease communities that much more quickly. So in addition to the 25 million that was appropriated for the NIH Expanded Access Grants Program and the NIH portions of the bill, there's also $5 million that was appropriated for this year, for right now, to go to this grants program. And so we anticipate that this will be announced at about the same time, maybe actually in tandem with the publication of the FDA regulatory action plan that I just told you about a second ago, so that maybe around the end of June or so, we're going to get not only that action plan, we're also going to get the details of this program. We might even get it sooner, you never know. We've been surprised before, but at the very least, we're hoping that it can be released about in tandem with the action plan as that is being published, hopefully again at the end of June. Okay, so let's move to the final slide, because as I said at the outset, yes, this bill was authorized for $100 million a year, but it only was appropriated for $30 million. And there was several reasons for that that we don't necessarily need to get into right now. But we have the opportunity and the hope, certainly, that we can get the full $100 million for next fiscal year, that fiscal year starting, of course, in October and running through the following September. So just to give everyone an update on kind of where the appropriations process is right now, you might be wondering, where do we stand with that $100 million? So the appropriators are kind of just starting their process. They've been working on this just for a little bit now. They passed their big bill again in early March. They took a little bit of a breather because frankly, they deserved it at that point. But now they're kicking off the appropriations process again right now for next fiscal year. And that includes two things, at least for right now. They're holding hearings with federal agencies where the heads of the federal agencies come in front of Congress and say, this is what we believe we would like for appropriations for next year. That's, of course, the president's budget outlines that, and the federal agencies come to Congress and then tell appropriators about it. And then also the appropriators collect requests from members, so senators and representatives, as well as outside organizations for what we all want to see within the appropriations for fiscal year 23. And we are very pleased to join with IMALS and ALS Association just a few months back and asking for the full $100 million authorization, appropriation for the authorization of Act for ALS. And of course, we'll be communicating that to the Hill here as they are working on their appropriations for fiscal year 23 as well, to do our very best, if there is to be an appropriations bill that passes, that there will be $100 million of appropriated funds for Act for ALS within that legislation. I'll just add one note of pessimism, perhaps. Of course, this appropriation would pass by October 1st if it is to pass prior to the end of the current funding. You might know, of course, there's a big election that is a month and 3 or 4 days thereafter. Things get very political on Capitol Hill. They already are right now, of course, but they'll be even more political come September. So the possibility of actually passing a consensus bipartisan big funding package a month before an election, doesn't oftentimes happen. What happens usually instead is they pass a continuing resolution in which they just take the funding numbers and percentages from the previous appropriations bill, which of course this would be the one that was passed in March, and just extend that further to a date in which they give themselves another deadline to pass more funding. That could be a month, that could be 2 months, that could be a week, who knows? But let's hope that they actually do pass appropriations, and that included within that appropriations, there's $100 million for Act for ALS. Okay, we have 2 minutes here at the end of our call. As I pull up the 2 additional questions, let me just reiterate again, please join us in MDA's Advocacy Network. You can do so either at our webpage there or texting MDA USA to 50457. You can always email us too if you have any questions for us. You can find us at advocacy@mdausa.org. Okay, so 2 quick questions. Dr. Torberg, I'm going to start with you and a question from Michelle on the NIH funding levels for ALS research, the graph that you showed us. There's a question about, is that solely for ALS, or could there be FTD ALS and there also Alzheimer's FTD research within that graph, or is it solely for ALS specifically?
No, it does include grants that are ALS and FTD. So they all have an ALS component to the grant. So the way grants are coded at NIH is that if it's on a disease, the entire dollar amount is counted towards that disease. So for example, as many of you know, that there are genetic mutations that predispose people to developing both ALS and FTD. Well, any grant that's on those genetic mutations are really grants that are on both diseases. And there's no way to really tease that apart if you're trying to understand the molecular mechanisms of that grant. So it does include ALS and FTD as well as just ALS. But there's all of our grants are coded for many different parameters, let's say.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I just have one final question, and this pertains to who might qualify for the expanded access programs that could be funded through the ALS expanded access. And this is from Jean. I think this is actually the first question that was submitted, and we're getting to it last. So Jean, I hope you're still with us. Apologies, it took us a little while to get here, but they ask a question about those with hereditary or familial ALS who have, they, as Jean describes, they appear to be healthy, but they have the biomarkers for hereditary or familial ALS, and whether they might be able to qualify for an expanded access program that could be funded under this program. So Dr. Caparella or Dr. Torberg, Jean has the impression that they wouldn't be able to qualify, but is Jean correct, or was there any, would you add anything to that?
So, so I can answer, I mean, from the NIH lens, there's nothing in the RFA that we, added to the language or to any FDA policies that would exclude carriers. And there's certainly research questions that I imagine could be very relevant to include carriers in. What I don't know and why I can't say for certain that, yes, carriers are allowed and eligible is I would have to examine the law of the language of the law and the FDA policy about expanded access to really be able to say, yes, they're eligible. But I can say that nothing that the NIH, put into the mix here is going to exclude carriers if the other, two components here do not. I would say, and maybe just a good message overall for attendees today is to that individual, especially if they're involved with potentially an application that's considering including carriers, please reach out again to myself, to Dr. Conway, to Amelie Gubitz. We could talk about that in more detail and really take a close look and try to get you a clear answer to that question for a specific application. And I will leave that message for everyone today. Companies and sites, if you're thinking of putting in an application, please reach out and we'd be happy to go through your specific questions in more depth.
Fantastic. Well, I think with that,
Oh,
we are ready to.
Paul, I'm so sorry. Can I add just one quick thing,
Please
just
do.
so that there's
Absolutely.
no confusion on this? The RFA does mention a letter of intent that needs to be submitted 30 days in advance. That is a standard thing. It is not a requirement. So if you're just now thinking of putting in an application or working with a team to put in an application, you are still welcome to do so, and still please come talk to us. You have not missed an opportunity to do so.
Wonderful. That's a great note to end on there, Dr. Caparella. Thank you so much, Dr. Torberg. Thank you so much for volunteering an hour of your evening to join us and members of the ALS and neuromuscular disease community today to talk about Act for ALS. We're thrilled about all the progress that's already being made, and we're looking forward to seeing where we go from here. So with that, I'll just thank everybody for joining us this evening, and everyone have a good rest of your Tuesday evening.
Thanks for having us, Paul.
Thank you so much.